You're watching The New Stack Makers, a podcast for people who develop, deploy, and manage at-scale software. For more information and articles about at-scale technologies, please visit thenewstack.io. Now enjoy the show. Hey everyone, it's Alex here, and we're trying some new things at The New Stack with our podcasts and videos. And so if you're listening to this on The New Stack Makers, there is actually a video presentation that goes with this now, and you can see that on the New Stack page on YouTube. We will sure to provide that link in the show notes. So without any further ado, to be cliche in some respects, I'd like to say hi to my co-host for today's show, Adrian Cockroft. Adrian, how are you?
Fine, thanks. It's good to see you again. And it's good to be doing a little bit more analyst work as well nowadays.
Yes, we're so excited about this new step in your own life and career and interests. And we're so lucky to have you as a co-host on this show today. And hopefully we'll see you more in the New Stack in other ways, maybe a story or two, maybe at a conference, who knows? But it's so nice to have you here. And I have been very curious about how we think about AI at the New Stack. And it's come down to thinking through, like, what is it that we really like to talk about at the New Stack? We like to talk about things that are new. We like to talk about how these new technologies work. How do you explain them? And so today we're talking about LLM apps, those AI-based apps that use LLM technologies. And it's increasingly apparent that they're going to need a lot of monitoring. We're just at the very beginning of things. I'm wondering how you might categorize where we are today, Adrian.
Yeah, I think we've kind of been in the last year in a lot of the tinkering kind of phase where people have been running experiments. And we're starting to see a lot of services, a lot of startups coming out saying lots of different offerings coming to market. But I don't think it's organized itself into a stack yet, right? Yeah. What is the new stack for this? There's bits and pieces of it that are becoming fairly clear, but it's not at all obvious what the stack is, what it needs to do. So that's what we're going to talk about. I'm interested to explore this area a little bit more as it starts to mature, because I think as people move from the research lab part of their business to, okay, we've got a thing, let's see if we can put it in production. That's where all of a sudden you go, wow, this is costing a lot, or it's just unreliable, or it keeps doing crazy things. Those sorts of problems are popping up. And if you're an enterprise that's just getting into AI because that's what everyone's doing, then you've got to figure out all those things and figure out which vendors you assemble and what tools you assemble from open source to solve all these problems.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about, how we're looking at things beyond the chatbots. We've seen so many chatbots, but there's a lot of new technologies that are emerging. I think some of the technologies that we're going to talk about later, for instance, are like examples of these new technologies, like LangChain. I'm curious on, what do you see as that generation app beyond chatbots themselves that will require this monitoring capability?
Yeah, I think we've got pretty clear examples of using chatbots for things like replacing call center conversations, so customer support. That's pretty clear. And for generating art, still images in particular, it's now pretty quick. I need an image. If I can describe it, I can get it. You don't have to contract someone to go and do it. So it's got much easier to generate artwork. And then we're starting to see a little bit of video as well. I recently saw a video. I was at a company offsite kind of event, and there was a video that was played at the beginning. It looked really good. And then a bit later, they said, by the way, that was just generated with AI. And nobody really realized that. And they showed what the first version looked like. And it was, okay, the first version, you see the weird shapes of faces and too many fingers and stuff. But they did dial all that out. But it was just a conversational app was to produce a promo video. So this is getting to be really powerful for creative things as a sort of to augment people that have got an idea, but then you can get it delivered. And then you see AI being embedded in things, like in terms of, if you're looking at operations infrastructure, there are tools for looking at incidents and alerts and trying to make sense of what's going on. And we've been using AI in those areas for a while, but I think they're getting much more sophisticated now because they can think much more broadly about what is going on, much more context for figuring out what went wrong. I think those are the sort of primary areas that of interest.
So I thought we'd try to get through some questions that I discussed the other day with John Akiram, MSV, who is a well-known analyst and a writer for the New Stack. And in our discussion, we talked about, the importance of monitoring. Why use monitoring in AI apps that use LLMs? What are the new golden signals? What are those signals you need to be thinking about so your apps behave properly? How do they complement existing, open source, open source standards that we've seen emerge over the years, like such as, what we see emerge out of like technologies in the open source realm, such as open telemetry. So how do we complement those existing golden signals? And what questions should people be asking? What should they be asking about when they're building a scaling operation? I'm just curious, to think, get your perspective, Adrian, if you're like a CIO or even a CTO at a big organization and everyone's doing all these projects, you would expect to have lots of questions you want to have answered to make sure that things are not going haywire.
Yeah, and I think that the usual questions, like what risks have you got? Is it going to work? And then what's it going to cost? The usual kind of questions like that. And I think that we're starting to see that some of these API calls, they take a long time to run. There's a lot of work going on. They're pretty expensive to run. So as you start getting these things built, people are saying, well, okay, I built it using the generic APIs from OpenAI or Anthropic or whatever, but I need to go train my own model or do fine tuning on one of the open source models, perhaps, or license a model and tweak it. And now you're into something that looks like a very expensive batch job. Right, those training jobs are extremely expensive. They run for a long time. You've got to go build out something that looks like a high-performance computing network to go do that. And then if you get a serious amount of inference running against it, you've got this very compute-intensive workload sort of sitting in the middle of your data center or your cloud environment that you're trying to figure out how to manage. So I think it's one of those times when something new and different has appeared and you've got to go figure it out. Like a decade or so ago, as we had sort of Docker and containers, and people had to go figure out, okay, here's a new way of running things, new tooling, new ways of doing it. Similarly with cloud, every time there's been a new technology, eventually, IT has absorbed how to manage it, but we're just in the early stages right now.
The ethics are interesting because I don't necessarily think of ethics when I think about container architectures, but we're now in a world where the data is constantly being fed, it's constantly changing. And so then that does bring up the question about why is monitoring so important to these AI-based LLM apps? And that gets into those questions about ethical behavior, performance. I'm curious on your take on what performance means, how you would think about evaluating performance, how you think about real-time metrics, how you think about sentiment analysis, toxicity. These are whole different forms of monitoring considerations, aren't they?
Yeah, and ethics, it's a little bit relative, right? Depends who you are, whether you think something's being ethical, whether you believe in it or not, right? So what is your audience? Who are you trying to produce answers for actually helps drive some of that. There is a base level of ethics, but in terms of what social norms you have The world is very different as you go around the world. Every culture and even different sort of tribal groups within cultures, if you like, have different expectations. And if you train an LLM on the world, then you get sort of the average behavior, right? But that means it's a bit, it's on average, it's probably sexist, it's probably racist, it's probably got all kinds of other things in there. So what you have to do then is tune the system to design out the behaviors you don't want, to have it sort of stay in the zone for whatever matches your corporate brand or whatever that you're trying to match. And that's a difficult thing to get right. And it's one of the things, there's a lot of tooling around that. And that's one of the golden metrics. It's like, is the thing staying on message, or is it going off and producing something that shouldn't be there? And that's that we're seeing a number of, if you get into one of these tools, you can probably persuade it to do something bad. And then there's a story about it. And then you're in the news with a bad story, right? So it's very difficult right now to prevent that happening. So you have to kind of build guardrails around it and understand whether this application is subject to that kind of issue.
This is an interesting point in the story where the narrative is so young, where the discussions are so just forming, and it speaks to then the importance of these larger LLM environments such as AWS Bedrock and OpenAI and Vertex AI and even LangChain, doesn't it?
Yeah, and what's happening is these guardrails are being built into these toolkits because everybody's got this problem. So the providers, and LangChain is one of the open source kind of toolkits that's sort of more emergent, but that they all have tooling that will help detect that. So you give a prompt to a model, you get a response. You have another model that is basically just looking for bad responses. It's looking at that. It looks at the input and the output, and it tries to say, is this a good response? Is this did it do something sexist or something that doesn't conform with the brand identity we want it to follow, right? And those kind of things are difficult to train out. For example, we were looking a little bit at Climate GPT, right? So
Right.
it's an LLM that's being trained to be a climate scientist, basically to understand. You can ask it questions about the climate. They fed it a bunch of climate denier ideas as well, and then they were monitoring it to make sure it didn't pull them back. So it was built in as an anti-example, but as they're monitoring it, they're trying to make sure that it doesn't produce an output which is either incorrect according to the science, or which sort of, if a denier is using it, they can't sort of goad it into producing a denier meme, if you like. So there's a very nice paper on that I think we'd link to in the show notes.
Yeah.
It's from Erasmus.ai in Holland. A good, interesting project.
Yeah, it is a very interesting project. Lots of approaches that they took, just that are way beyond kind of the consideration here with apps that are built on LLMs. We're actually building the models themselves and how they use pre-trained models and such. We'll definitely provide notes to that. And this gets into LangChain, which is just emerging as well. It came out around the time ChatGPT did. And Johnny again compared it to the JDBC, which emerged in the 1990s, the Java database controller, and essentially, you can think of LangChain as an LLM based app that is essentially middleware. Do you see that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it fits in that same space. So if you look at what JDBC was, the standard, once you learned how to use it, you didn't really have to care what database your Java app was connected to. It just was how to take a query, something you needed to query in Java, and connect it to the database with one API. And LangChain basically does that. If you have some code that wants to query a language model, then you use LangChain to do that and set it all up. And LangChain will talk to whatever model you want behind it. And then LangChain also has built into it the various components for doing these, checking that your output makes sense and looking at all of the sort of performance and capacity and ethical sort of concerns. So those are all sort of accumulated into the LangChain kind of model, or LangChain sort of platform.
And what's interesting to me about LangChain, it kind of gets to what we were talking about earlier with why monitoring is so important in these apps, right? So the technologists at LangChain, I'm sure, are thinking a lot about monitoring and observability, and they've actually started building, monitoring capabilities within LangChain, and this speaks to me as this type of application that is almost from the future, where we'll see just a lot more applications such as this.
Yeah. There's I think we're just on that cusp of where people are trying to get these apps out into production and figuring out what's going on as they do it.
They are using this new tool, LangSmith, which is really young. It's designed to debug, test, and evaluate and monitor chains and intelligent agents. What's your view on LangSmith? Why LangSmith?
Well, I think LangSmith's coming from the people that built LangChain.
Right.
But right now it's in private beta, so there are a few people using it. The tool that's been around a little bit longer is called LangKit, and that is a little bit more developed in some ways, but probably less integrated. So what we've got here is the typical kind of thing that happens in open source that we've seen over the years, right? There's an open source version of something, it becomes successful, then a company is built around it, and that company then starts figuring out, okay, I'm looking for real customers. How can I add value? What are the problems we've got in more commercial environments? So if you just want to use LangChain, you can do it, no problem. But if you're an enterprise wanting to integrate it into your, typically you want to integrate into Active Directory, and you want to have enterprise monitoring, and you've got some support kind of things, right? There's all these things that enterprises want, and you want to have a whole bunch of tooling around that. So I think that seems to be what LangSmith is in terms of building out the functionality to make LangChain easier to use.
Now, this takes us to this presentation that you came across, and I added it to the discussion here. And this is from WhyLabs. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, I think WhyLabs, they're probably a competitor to the LangChain and LangSmith toolkit. They're an independent startup that's building, again, some open source, but with some commercialization on top. And they're putting out regular tutorials on monitoring LLMs. Every month or two, they run one. There's one that was put out, I think, earlier in January, in January 2024, from Bernice Herman. And it was just a really nice introduction. She went through all of the, why is this a problem? How are you going to deal with it? All the different moving parts. What does this look like? And then with a demo at the end showing how to do it in practice, with it being open source and then using the free tooling that WhyLabs has as well. So as you'd expect, this is what you'd expect from a developer advocate kind of thing, right?
Right.
Come and use our tool. But it was a really nicely put together presentation, I think, worth watching on YouTube.
Yeah, and I kind of like this part of the presentation where they're talking about the evaluation, and understanding models. I think this is pretty well done. Like, what you're really trying to do is finding all these relational points, correct? I mean, that's essentially kind of what this reflects to me.
Yeah. The quality of the model is important, right? Is it getting the right answer enough of the time? Do you have a ground truth? Some models have a ground truth, like they do or don't have the right answer. They're trying to predict something, and others don't. Like the quality of an image, I made you a picture. There isn't a ground truth for that. Did I like it or not is really as good as you're going to get. But there are definitely areas where you can go back and say that the prediction was correct or not correct. All right.
And for the listeners out there, I'm looking at a slide in this deck, which you'll see, and it's evaluating and understanding the quality of the models, and and how how essentially monitoring in LLMs, it's about analyzing the changes in the quality over time. How does that distinguish? How is that just different than how we've thought about monitoring, you know, in distributed architecture, standard technologies that didn't use, LLM based technologies for added context and depth?
I think we've historically in enterprises, they had a pretty slow rate of change, right? The data center environments would change, maybe you'd release code every month or every 6 months or something. And then we got into a more agile delivery for web services. But I think this is a whole step up from that. The rate of change is another order of magnitude higher because we're seeing things like new models coming out every month or two that are, I saw one today, 10 to 100 times more efficient is their claim. For doing basically the same thing that you were doing some other way for the last couple of months. Right? And if you're going to see changes that are that dramatic in that time frame, you have to think of what you've built as something you're just iterating on. It's a series of prototypes. Even if you've got it in production, you're going to be revving this and throwing away old implementations and starting again. So it's not like you're trying to build a highly compatible system that's going to work for a long time. You're going to find the thing you've built stops working in 6 months or a year because it depends upon a bunch of stuff that no longer is being maintained because everybody's moved on. So it's a little bit more building on shifting sands, right? It's not a stable environment, but if you don't do it and you don't figure it out, you'll be falling behind your competition. So I think everybody's working this out, but it's very much in the exploratory the exploratory end of things rather than this is a settled, we're tuning it and we know how to optimize it end of things.
Yeah, and I think the golden signals uh, relate to that, don't they?
Yeah. Yeah, you want to know how quickly this thing responds. If as you make your model more and more sophisticated with more checks in it, it slows down because every layer of checking takes time and you're trying to get more and more information in there. So one of the issues is, is the customer going to sit around long enough to wait for the response? So that's one problem. Then the other thing is if you get a burst of traffic where lots of people start trying to use your model at once for some reason, it went viral or there's some external event driving people to whatever you're doing, then you've got a lot of concurrency and you might not have enough capacity, so everything could slow down there. So that's one monitoring signal, but that's a traditional one. We've looked at latency for years.
Mm-hmm.
It's just
Mm-hmm.
that in this case, these are fairly slow responses anyway, and they're very expensive to run.
Yes.
So it's the one that isn't on this list, I'd say, is cost and the sort of FinOps movement. Like, how do you know how much it's costing to process these things? And if you're trying to replace a human with a chatbot, then if the chatbot costs more than the human, and it's not as good, then why are you bothering, right? You have to kind of have something that is substantially better and cheaper than doing it manually.
So getting to the end of the discussion and thinking about questions to ask about monitoring AI-based LLM apps, I know there's going to be a lot of people out there who are going to need to know what questions to ask, especially as the people on their team start exploring more with generative AI and LLMs.
Yeah. One of the problems you can get is people deliberately trying to break the model. You've built a sort of a sandbox that understands some domain knowledge. Like, for example, this climate GPT thing, it's supposed to be a climate expert. You're not supposed to be able to ask it questions about other topics. And people find ways of working around the prompts and injecting things that will break out of it. So you have to figure out, so who's doing that? Do you want to identify which user is trying to break your model and block that user, for example? So that's one identity. You can't just have this open to the world. You have to track the identity. And then you've got, are the results being hallucinated? Is it making up URLs that don't exist or papers that didn't exist that sound plausible? Then the throttling from lots of traffic coming in? Are you out of capacity? Is this thing slowing down? And then there's this idea about how many tokens are you generating, but also there's the context. These models typically have a certain size of context. They can sort of gather together information up to a certain limit. Are you running into that limit? Do you need to replace it with a model with a larger context? How much prompt are you trying to jam into it before you ask the question? All of those different things are sort of becoming problems that you need to ask and figure out what is actually going on in your system.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Adrian, for taking the time today to discuss this topic of monitoring with monitoring apps that are built with LLMs. It's been interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's this nice emerging area. I always like to be thinking about things that are coming out and developing. And it's a topic that I'll be returning to in the coming months. I'm going to be writing up a few things. Probably go to Monitorama. Well, I always go to Monitorama in Portland. Yeah. I'll see you there. But I think we may do a topic around this at Monitorama to see what's happening there. And I'm also sort of talking about this with a few other venues. So just try and bounce these ideas around and see if I can develop a little bit more intuition about what's really happening.
Great. Well, thanks for your time, Adrian.
Thank you.
If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.